I want to welcome everyone to this, our 8th annual Public Interest Conference here at Emory Law. For those of you who are visitors, I thought it might be helpful to explain a little bit about what EPIC is and what we do here at the law school. The Emory Public Interest Committee, lovingly known as EPIC, is the largest and most active student organization on campus. Our mission is to encourage and support public interest work in every way that we can. To us, public interest work means providing legal assistance to underrepresented populations. It doesn't matter whether you want to go to work at legal aid or go into big law. As aspiring lawyers, we believe it is our duty to give back to our communities. And upon graduation, and hopefully passing the bar, we will be given an awesome amount of responsibility and power over other people's lives. So EPIC's goal is to help students find and cultivate their passion for service. We do this in a variety of ways throughout the year, and I'll list a couple of those for you now. We help students explore and build public interest careers, connect students to community organizations and service opportunities, raise money to provide summer grants for public interest internships through our feature event in the spring, the EPIC Inspiration Awards. Hope to see you all there. And of course, hold a conference on a timely and important public interest topic every fall. And the annual conference plays a crucial role in EPIC's mission. It brings together experts from a wide variety of disciplines to help us better understand the challenges of serving a particular population. I can tell you that our conference co-chairs, Anila and Ashley, have done an amazing job planning an event that should introduce us to a wide variety of child law issues. And it is my hope that we leave today armed with ideas on how to improve the systems that govern the lives of children. So if you have any questions about EPIC, please feel free to stop me or any of the members of the student board throughout the day. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to a great friend of public interest and our dean, Robert Shapiro, to give you a few words of welcome.
Well, Kristen, thanks so much for those kind words and for your great leadership in the public interest at Emory Law School. I'd like to thank all of you for being here today to participate in this important event, and special thanks to Anila and to Ashley, who have done so much work to make this conference a reality. It really wouldn't happen without you, and we're all very grateful for your efforts. Now, the public interest is indeed central to the legal profession. When one thinks about what it means to be a lawyer, service to the public has to be at the core of that, and that's what we try to emphasize in everything that we do at Emory Law School. Of course, a leader in that is EPIC, the Emory Public Interest Committee, and all that that organization does. But in other ways as well, we try to make the public interest mission important and available to our students. We have it through our clinics and field placement programs, our public interest fellowships, during the time that students are here and after they graduate, our pro bono program, and so much more. The challenges of public interest law are indeed great. It has been said that the rule of law is an unqualified human good, that it's a cultural achievement of universal significance. And so it is, but it's an achievement whose benefits are not universally enjoyed around the world or in the United States. And that's part of the challenge that public interest lawyers face, to try to make the promise of the rule of law a reality for all members of society. Those challenges are particularly great for the most vulnerable, those whom the law may not see or those we as citizens may not always see, and particularly for those who cannot speak for themselves. And that brings us to the topic of this conference. When one thinks about who are the most vulnerable members of society, and those who cannot speak for themselves, one of course thinks of children. Children who are often viewed as being outside the law, below the law, not fully entitled to the protections of the law. Children who often cannot speak for themselves, and in fact it was often viewed as they should not speak for themselves. Right? Children should be seen and not heard. So the challenge of bringing the protection of law to children is an important one indeed, and such an appropriate topic for a conference on public interest law. Now, it's especially appropriate for there to be a conference on children and the law at Emory. We pride ourselves at Emory on integrating the theory and practice of law, of critical study and reflection, on the deepest foundations of law, and also reflecting on how law can be applied and on working for social change and positive transformation. So when we think about child law, we have the leading scholars in the world on child law here at Emory. You'll be hearing in a moment from Barbara Woodhouse, and we have so many others as well: Martha Feynman, Martha Grace Duncan, Melissa Carter, Kirsten Widener, Steve Reba, Kosha Tucker, many of whom you'll be hearing from today as they reflect on what it means to think about children and the law and the rights of the child. It's also very appropriate that this conference takes place at Emory because it connects very closely to our Vulnerability and the Human Condition Initiative. And again, when one thinks about who is so vulnerable in society, children are at the forefront of that list. So it connects deeply with our study of the law, but of course also with what we do to try to change and transform the world, and particularly through our clinics, and the Barton Child Law and Policy Clinic. That's a clinic that brings together the representation of children and advocacy on behalf of policy on behalf of children. It provides classes, it provides internships, it works for change in Georgia and around the world. So again, having the Barton Clinic at Emory makes it very appropriate that this body be here to study children and the law. So I really just like to say thank you. Thank you to the organizers again of the conference. Thank you for being here. It's hard to imagine a topic that is more vital and more urgent, or to think about participants who would be better able to address the question. And as I've said, I think this is an ideal setting in which to think about these questions. So I look forward to an outstanding exploration of the past, present, and future of child law, and welcome you all here today. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean Shapiro, for those compelling remarks. Welcome, everyone, to the 2011 Emory Public Interest Committee, appropriately referred to as EPIC, conference. We thank you, EPIC attendees and panelists, for making this conference possible today. I am Anila Ganowardana.
And I'm Ashley Webb-Ornstein.
And we are the 2011 EPIC Conference co-chairs. We hope that you all enjoy the conference today and that you come away with a better understanding of the unique way that children are situated in relation to the law. Today, we wanted to bring together practitioners, students, and people from the community to talk about the plight of children who cannot always advocate for themselves. We chose the theme Child Law, Past, Present, and Future to showcase historical trends, current issues at the forefront of the law today, and future implications in the field of child law.
We want this to be a rewarding and interactive experience for all attendees, combining panel presentations with discussion and networking opportunities. Advocating for the underserved, who are unaware or unable to have their own voice in the socio-political system, is a theme of both EPIC and the larger field of public interest. We hope you all enjoy the conference, and now we'd like to welcome our keynote speaker, Emory Law Professor Barbara Woodhouse. She is not only an expert in the field of child law, but also a champion of children's rights. Professor Woodhouse received her JD from Columbia University Law School and was law clerk to Associate Justice Sandra Day O'Connor of the U.S. Supreme Court. Her book, Hidden in Plain Sight, The Tragedy of Children's Rights from Ben Franklin to Lionel Tate, won the American Political Association's 2009 award for Best Book on Human Rights. She was also named a Human Rights Hero by the ABA Journal on Human Rights in 2005. And she serves as co-director of the Barton Child Law and Policy Clinic. Welcome, Professor Woodhouse.
Well, first of all, I wanted to thank Anila and Ashley for all their hard work. They have been working on this so vigorously and with such creativity for a long time, since last spring. And I'd also like to thank our dean for his excellent and encouraging remarks about children and the law here at Emory. I have a small correction to make, which is that I was a co-director for a while and then acting director of the Barton Center, but now that we have Melissa Clark as our executive director and a full panoply of fabulous lawyers, I stepped back into the role of faculty advisor. I don't think they really need a co-director anymore with all this talent. But I'm very proud of my association with Barton, and it continues strong and vigorous. Now, the theme of our conference today is child law past, present, and future. And that's an invitation to look back at history, as well as to look forward in our crystal ball. In my talk this morning, I will trace how children's legal status in America has changed. I will examine where we are today, and I will try to imagine what lies ahead. Child law barely existed at the time our nation began. Children are never mentioned in the Constitution, but the Founding Fathers certainly had future generations in mind when they committed in the preamble to secure the blessings of liberty for ourselves and our posterity. When those words were written, American children were a long way from being free. Children's legal status was very similar to that of a chattel or a piece of property. Fathers had absolute rights to control their children. They had the power to enroll their children in the military and collect his pay packet, to bind the child out in indenture for many years, and to bequeath him in their wills to someone other than his mother. It's a little-known fact that this country was built in large part by working indentured children. While children born into slavery were enslaved for life, over half the so-called free children who settled the colonies south of New England came to America under indentures. Their average age was 14. Often they were swept off the streets of cities like Liverpool or London and indentured by the local poor authorities as vagrants. I gained this insight reading the autobiography of Frederick Douglass, the great abolitionist. As a teenager lying on a hillside in Maryland and watching ships sailing north to freedom, he comforted himself with this thought: I am but a boy, and all boys are bound to someone. Being bound to a master in slavery or in indenture was the norm for American children in colonial days. But being enslaved for life, this was what the teenage Douglass could not tolerate. While still a minor, Douglass escaped to lead the battle for his people's freedom. Another famous man who rebelled against bondage as a child was Benjamin Franklin. Abused by his master and threatened with jail for his revolutionary writings, the 16-year-old printer's apprentice became a fugitive from justice. He escaped to Philadelphia as a stowaway on a sailing vessel. And as they say, the rest is history. Kids have often escaped injustice by running away. Dred Scott's daughters, pictured here with their parents, were teenage runaways. While their father's case was before the Supreme Court, they went into hiding, and they did not return until their parents had been bought and freed by a sympathetic supporter. But even as free children, like all other minors, their freedom did not include the rights of free women, let alone of free men. They had no rights to keep their own wages, to choose where to live, whom to marry, or whether to work or study. But these were just the normal incidents of being a minor child. The Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment spelled the end to slavery as a legal status, but the promise of freedom remained hollow, especially for African American children. Almost immediately, many thousands of black children were removed from their parents' custody and placed back in the care of their former masters. What was the legal rationale for this re-enslavement? The masters had persuaded local authorities to declare the parents unfit to care for their children because of poverty or alleged immorality. So back into the masters' fields the children went, this time as wards of the state. Until well into the 20th century, the majority of children of all colors worked to put food on the table for themselves and their families. In developing nations today, child labor is still a necessary evil. Many American children were employed in dangerous jobs that took a permanent toll on their health and precluded them from gaining an education. But we should never imagine these working children as helpless and pitiful victims. Children fought hard, side by side with their elders, to establish decent working conditions and living wages. These two girls from New York's Lower East Side are wearing signs that say, in English and in Yiddish, "Abolish child slavery." It was not until the 1930s, during the New Deal that followed the Great Depression, that Congress enacted laws regulating child labor. Conservatives, including many of the 9 old men, fought these laws tooth and nail, believing they would lead to the destruction of parental authority. But images like this one mobilized a struggling but still rich nation to create a safety net for children and families. Americans were responding with empathy and solidarity to seeing their neighbors and fellow citizens forced out of their homes and off their farms by foreclosure and unemployment. The next giant step for children also followed a time of suffering and crisis. As Anne Frank's journal reminds us, children murdered in the Holocaust suffered persecution not only because of their race or religion, but also because of their age. In the Nazi concentration camps, children were separated on arrival according to age, with those below 16 sent immediately to the gas chambers or the ovens, because they were considered too weak to be of use to the Nazi war machine. Anne, who had just turned 16 when she arrived in Bergen-Belsen, was spared, only to die of typhus a few months before the camp was liberated. Out of the ashes of the war, which created untold suffering for millions of children, came the United Nations. UNICEF was born. And in 1959, the UN issued the Declaration on the Rights of the Child. This charter recognized that children have special rights to protection and nurture flowing from their needs and their vulnerabilities. But racism still blighted the futures of all children in the USA. I like to quote Thurgood Marshall in his oral argument in Cooper v. Aaron, when he told the court that the time for all deliberate speed in integrating Little Rock schools was past. After a brutal year of violence and intimidation, a federal district court had bowed to pressure not to reopen the public schools. I will quote Marshall's oral argument at length, although I cannot possibly match his passion or his sonorous voice. He said, "Education is not the teaching of the 3 R's. Education is the teaching of the overall citizenship, to learn to live together with fellow citizens, and above all, to learn to obey the law. And the damage to the education in Arkansas and in Little Rock and in Central High comes about through the order of Judge Lemley, which says that not only the school board and the state can and should submit to mob violence and threats of mob violence, but that the federal judiciary likewise should do so. I don't know of any more horrible destruction of principle of citizenship than to tell young children that those of you who withdrew rather than go to school with Negroes, those of you who were punished last year, the few that were punished, come back, all is forgiven, you win." And therefore, I'm not worried about the Negro children at this stage. I don't believe they're in this case as such. I worry about the white children in Little Rock, who are told as young people that the way to get your rights is to violate the law and defy the lawful authorities. I'm worried about their future. I don't worry about those Negro kids' future. They've been struggling with democracy long enough. They know about it. The court issued its opinion the next day, and it was unanimous. Marshall's words remind us of a fact that we must never forget. What is at stake in the fight for children who are still suffering from discrimination and deprivation is nothing less than the souls of all our children and of our nation. We should also never forget that many of the foot soldiers in the movement were children, and many of those courageous youths were ready to break unjust laws, be beaten, go to jail, and even to be killed in their fight for racial equality. John Lewis, now my congressman, but forever my hero, defied his parents and joined the movement while he was still a college student and still legally a minor. Here he is, being beaten on Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma in 1965. The law books, as well as the photographic record, are filled with images of elementary and high school students who were on the front lines in the battle for school desegregation. But young people were also on the front lines in the fight to abolish Jim Crow in all its manifestations, from bus stations to lunch counters to voter registration. Often, they remained anonymous because their names were never written down when they were arrested. In Birmingham, in spring of 1963, over 10,000 children went to jail during what became known as the Children's Crusade. They had been schooled in the strategies of peaceful protest and civil disobedience by James Bevel, who was working side by side with the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. When these kids were offered a chance to go free, they told their parents not to bail them out. When the jails were full to overflowing, the kids had to be held on the county fairgrounds, and still they kept coming. By their sheer numbers, and by mobilizing sentiment across the country, the children of Birmingham forced the city to come to the table. The 50s and 60s were a time of much more than hula hoops and rock and roll. During this era, the Supreme Court issued a string of landmark cases recognizing children's rights. Brown v. Board of Education in 1954 extended the protection of the 14th Amendment to outlaw segregated schools. In re Galt in 1967 recognized the right of a juvenile accused of delinquent acts to have notice of the charges, to be able to call witnesses, and have the assistance of an attorney. And in a line of cases during the 1960s and 70s, the Supreme Court held that the Constitution's due process and equal protection clauses protected innocent children from being made to pay for the supposed sins of their parents. Going against centuries of tradition, the court struck down laws that sought to deter out-of-wedlock births by placing legal burdens on illegitimate children. In 1982, the court held in a case called Plyler v. Doe that states could not close their public schools to children based on their immigration status. Current immigration hawks may have forgotten this case, or perhaps are hoping to see it overruled. During the 1970s and 80s, Congress also got into the Children's Rights Act, passing a series of federal laws aimed at the newly discovered problem of child abuse and neglect. The Education for All Handicapped Children, the forerunner of the IDEA, was passed in 1975. Helen Keller, pictured here, would be pleased at how things have changed. She learned to read, write, and speak, although she could not see or hear. But she was lucky to be born into a prosperous family in the 1880s. She and her teacher, Annie Sullivan, dedicated their lives to promoting education for children with visual and hearing impairments. Today, all children with special educational needs have powerful rights. Another figure from history would be glad to see the progress made in recognizing the rights of LGBT and questioning children. This is the author Willa Cather, as a 14-year-old, growing up in Red Cloud, Nebraska in the 1880s. For many years, she insisted on being addressed as Dr. William Cather, and she gave her high school valedictory address in this identity, wearing jacket, collar, and tie. The apogee of Supreme Court recognition of children's rights of expression came in Tinker v. Des Moines School District in 1969. The Tinker decision, like many other leaps forward for children, came during a time of turmoil. Students were punished for wearing black armbands to protest against the Vietnam War. While the court has since cut back on Tinker in subsequent free speech cases, it still protects the rights of students to engage in peaceful protest, a right that is essential to citizens' engagement in a democratic society. Other changes in children's status have been less dramatic and more gradual, but equally revolutionary. The old rule that fathers automatically got custody of their children changed to a tender years presumption, keeping young children with their mothers. By the 1980s, the laws on child custody had shifted their focus so that the best interest of the child was the dominant standard for all custody decisions. This focus on children's developmental needs, rather than on adults' rights created by biological parentage, paved the way to recognition of non-traditional families formed through adoption and assisted reproduction. In 1989, the single most dramatic event in the history of child law occurred on the world stage, but was barely noticed in the USA. I am speaking about the debut of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, commonly called the CRC. This treaty is the most rapidly and widely adopted human rights charter in history. Although the United States played a large role in drafting it, and especially in ensuring that a fundamental principle would be the best interest of the child, the U.S. is one of only 2 nations that have not ratified this treaty. The other is Somalia, which has a slight problem with piracy and lacks a functioning government. The CRC is a detailed document that recognizes a wide range of rights for children in addition to their basic human rights as human beings. It creates a committee on the rights of the child to receive periodic reports and to comment upon progress or lack thereof in the nations that have signed the treaty. The CRC celebrated its 20th anniversary shortly after I joined the Emory faculty in 2009. And I was privileged to travel to the UN for a panel that included not just graying experts like myself, but vibrant young people like Ishmael Beah, author of A Long Way Gone, Memories of a Boy Soldier. You may have heard bad things about the CRC from its US opponents, but if you actually read it, you will find nothing in it to alarm you. The good news is that the US has ratified the 2 optional protocols to the CRC, one on child trafficking and the other on children as soldiers. So far, my talk has been all uplift and rejoicing. You might think that we had reached, or at least we're well on our way, to the nirvana of children's rights. Sadly, as you all know, and all too well, this is not the case. If anything, since the 1990s, we seem to have slowly retreated from our commitment to children's rights and to children's welfare. Today, there are too many children still being abused or neglected, too many going hungry, being barred from schools, or actually put behind bars in jails. We have our first African-American president in Barack Obama, but the world that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. imagined, where children's futures would be determined by their character and not the color of their skins, is still a distant dream. Punitive approaches to children who get in trouble in our schools and on our streets, combined with rising poverty rates that disproportionately affect children of color, are 2 of the reasons why more children than ever are poor and the jails of Birmingham are once more overflowing with children. This graph shows how rates of child poverty, after years of progress, are back at levels not seen since Lyndon Johnson declared a war on poverty in the 1960s. This pie chart from Birmingham for 2007 to 2008 shows all the different ways that kids can get in trouble and be arrested at school. Fighting, disorderly, criminal trespass, harassment, other felonies, and in 2% of the cases, weapons. The 500 kids referred to court from Birmingham schools are just one measure of the flood of cases all over the country that have turned many schools into pipelines to prison. This chart shows the disproportionate impact on minority children of these school disciplinary procedures. Rather than being rehabilitated by the juvenile justice system, children are too often humiliated and harmed by it. This is a Florida kindergartner being cuffed and taken to jail for having a tantrum in school. They are routinely shackled hand and foot in courts of law in Georgia as well as in Florida. Every time I see a kid in an orange jumpsuit shuffle into court, I ask myself, how can we tolerate this throwback to the days of child slavery? But once again, youth are putting themselves on the front lines of the fight to get rid of zero-tolerance policies that lead to incarceration instead of graduation. In 2005, in Roper v. Simmons, the Supreme Court struck down the juvenile death penalty as cruel and unusual. But life in prison without possibility of parole, or LWOP as we call it, continues to be cruel, usual, and legal. The recent decision in Graham v. Florida only makes LWOP unconstitutional for children whose crimes do not result in a fatality. It would not have saved Lionel Tate. Lionel crushed a playmate when he was 12 years old, and he was convicted of felony murder. The felony was child abuse. Here he is at age 14 as he hears the judge sentence him to life without parole. Child slavery has not disappeared, but it has gone underground. Atlanta was shocked to learn that it is a hub for sexual exploitation of children. While laws have been passed to criminalize domestic human trafficking, young girls are still being arrested and charged with prostitution. With the economic downturn, funding for services to victims has been cut. The Runaway Youth Safety Act has passed, partially addressing the problem of dangers to homeless youth with the help of Barton Center. But homelessness is becoming more widespread. More children are on the streets, living out of cars, and apt to be exploited and abused. Let's take a close look at the status of Georgia children today. These data are taken from a fact sheet issued a week ago by Kids Count and the Georgia Family Connection Partnership, titled "The Impact of the Recession on Georgia's Children and Families." And they are consistent with a national report from Children's Hospital of Philadelphia titled "The Effect of the Recession on Child Well-Being," published in 2010. Roughly 25%, or 1 in 4 of Georgia's children, are growing up in poverty. Can you imagine supporting a family of 4 on less than $22,000? But families in Georgia are often getting by on much less. Poverty is not only deep, it is concentrated. In some counties, as many as 40 to 50% of children live in poverty. The demand for food stamps, now called SNAP, has almost doubled since 2006, but this program still does not reach 1/3 of those who are eligible. It's tough all over the country. But how is Georgia doing in comparison with other states? Georgia has the 6th highest rate of foreclosures and the 10th highest rate of food hardship. It has one of the stingiest payments of temporary assistance to needy families. Hunger hurts children permanently and starting before they are born. So does neglect, lack of prenatal care, and lack of attention and supervision as infants and toddlers. We now know, thanks to sophisticated brain imaging and advances in neuroscience, that conception to 3 are the critical years of brain development. Babies and children need stimulation and nurture, as well as protection from trauma, in order to develop healthy brains. But in Georgia, while almost 65% of children have both parents in the labor force, daycare is out of reach at about $6,000 for 1 child of 4. How can we explain our priorities when we spend $20,500 per inmate to keep a person in prison, but only $8,500 per pupil to educate children in our schools? Access to education, we now know, begins far too late, missing the most important years of children's brain development. But for many young people, education also ends far too early. More than 1/3 of our kids are entering the workforce without a high school education. The national unemployment rate for young people 16 to 24 is at a record high of 22.5%, not seen since 1948. The rate for Black youth is 31.5%. The Georgia data about health and safety are equally grim. Too many children are going without health care. Too many are coming home to an empty house or are left home alone with only a television as babysitter. Too many children are dying before their first birthday or suffering the trauma of abuse and neglect, which we now know causes damage to their growing brains. If Georgia rates below most of the other states in the Union, it will certainly not please you to know that the United States rates at or near the bottom of the chart in measures of child well-being among member states of the OECD, the privileged club of developed nations. With all this bad news, I am almost afraid to ask, what does the future hold? I've always been an optimist. I am told by those who know me that I was born that way. But it feels as if somewhere along the line, the war against poverty turned into a war against the poor. We dismantled the safety net in order to bring down the national debt and then squandered our wealth in foreign wars and empty McMansions, leaving our children to pay the bills. The rising tide of inequality is lifting the rich ever higher, impoverishing the middle class, and sending the poor ever deeper into poverty. It's hard to be optimistic in the face of a deteriorating economic outlook that is causing even Europeans to unravel the safety nets they had built for their children. What is especially troubling is the mean-spirited tone of our political rhetoric. Or maybe it's the inability of our leaders to craft a solution that would protect vulnerable families from ruin and desperation. If only we could recapture the sense of solidarity with our neighbors that enabled us to forge a stronger economy and a fairer deal out of the hardships of the Great Depression and the Second World War. How bad must things get before that spirit of solidarity is reawakened? The optimist in me says that no crisis, however deep, can stop a determined nation. Advocates for children know what we need to do. We need to set new priorities if we are to improve the lives of our children and rebuild a broken society. We need to invest money now if we are ever going to get out of this crisis. We need jobs for parents and safe spaces for children. No, I am not going to break into a chant of pass this jobs bill. And we need to make family well-being and prevention of poverty, abuse, and neglect at the foundation of our social systems. We have to turn our priorities upside down. We need to marginalize punishment and social exclusion as the very last resort and not the first. If this were a food pyramid, the little triangle at the top where I put, well, my food pyramid looks very strange. So that's one of the things that I guess got changed by the different software. But it's a pyramid with a tiny little triangle at the top that says TPRs and jail, and then a very large area that's devoted to preventive services, and then an even larger foundation that includes things like family supports, unemployment insurance, safe neighborhoods. You get the picture. The children of the UN Special Session, if this were a food pyramid, the little triangle at the top where I put TPRs and jails would make them as rare as trans fats and Twinkies in a healthy diet. This is not an impossible dream. It is Europe before the Wall Street bubble burst, taking many European nations down with it. The children of the UN Special Session back in 2002 titled their report, A world fit for children is a world fit for everyone. Truer words were never spoken. So let's imagine a state of Georgia fit for children, in a nation fit for children, in a world fit for children. It is too painful to imagine the alternative. Huge rates of inequality among children are the stuff of nightmare. Like this image of children scrabbling in garbage to feed and clothe themselves. But that is what your money buys in a country where 1% of the people have 33.8% of the wealth, while the bottom half must survive on 2.5% of the wealth. Let's work on building a different future. Here's the inspiring image of the youth representative who delivered the message about a world fit for children. If Gabriella can believe, so can I. I trust that my mixed messages of hope and fear, celebration and anger have energized you for the day ahead and for the battle that lies beyond. As I look out at this audience, what I see is hope incarnate. What we need most of all, and what I see before me, is the next generation of advocates ready to fight for the future all of our children deserve. Thank you.